All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll so we can see our results. Got a lot of different folks here: attorneys, social workers, community members, CBOs, survivors, lots and lots of folks. So happy to have you all here today. Really excited to have this panel. We have an incredible group of experts in this space, and I'm just grateful to have you. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. We cannot see you or hear you. This is a webinar, so feel free to take care of yourselves. If you're somewhere warm like California, go for a walk, get some fresh air. I love to do that while I'm listening to webinars, or just get up and walk around, eat food, do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves. I know in this crazy world, sometimes we're not very good at that. So this is just a reminder, take care of yourself. And we will have questions. We'll save time for questions at the end. So go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and I may include some as we go, but also we'll definitely save some time at the end for questions. And just so you know, we will be recording this webinar. We are already recording, so please go ahead and share this with friends after you attend. And just know, I know a lot of people ask, are you going to record this? And we will record it, and we'll send it out to all of you after we're done. And I know people are still introducing yourselves. Please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. We're so happy to have you all here today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm beyond thrilled to introduce this incredible panel. Today with us, we have Jane Anderson, who's an attorney advisor at Equitas, Kate Kimmer, who is an anti-trafficking consultant and really just amazing human in this space, and Paul Vigar, who is our criminal law supervising attorney at Free to Thrive. I would love our panelists to introduce themselves and give just a little bit more background of their role in the anti-trafficking space and expertise on this topic. And I'll go ahead and start with Jane.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or afternoon for some of you. As an attorney advisor with Equitas, I provide training and consultation, technical support to folks that are working in this space. So whether that be prosecutors, law enforcement, victim service providers, judges. And my background is as a former prosecutor from the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office. I co-founded our human trafficking unit there back in 2010. And it ended up sort of being a standalone unit. And I had the privilege of trying most of Florida's first state level trafficking cases. So hopefully I bring that experience, and now as a training and technical support person, working with task forces and folks around the country, bring that to you all today, what we're seeing and really sort of some emerging trends as well. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jane. Kate, we'll go to you.
Well, it is afternoon on the East Coast, so good afternoon for those of you on this timetable. I'm Kate Kimmer. I'm just really excited to be here. I've been in the anti-trafficking field for 13 years and recently moved into some private consulting. And for the last 5 years or so, I ran a statewide task force. But through all of my work, I have really kind of found a niche in working with folks who have both experienced and caused harm. And what does it look like to really do transformative work in those spaces and break what many of us in this field see as generational curses. Entire neighborhoods or communities have been plagued. And so it's just exciting to be in a space with folks all across the spectrum to be talking about, I think, new and exciting ways to think about human trafficking and the folks it impacts, and what some primary prevention and exciting intervention tools could look like if we were willing to have some tough conversations like we are today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kate. And last but certainly not least, Paul Vigar, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jamie. Hi, everybody. My name is Paula Vigar. I am the criminal law supervising attorney at Free to Thrive. And before that, I too, just like Jane, was at the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office and got to work in the human trafficking unit that Jane helped found. And fun fact, I used to actually inherit cases that would come back on probation violations or on appellate issues with Jane's pretty notes all over them. So even though she wasn't there by the time I got to the unit, still got to learn from the work she had left behind. It's just a privilege to be here with all of you. It's amazing to see the different folks we have. I'm following the chat, and we have folks from all over the country who are doing all kinds of different anti-human trafficking work. So we really hope that this conversation today in some capacity helps you serve in your positions a little bit better. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Pallavi. So today's training, our discussion, is the third part in a series that we're calling Changing the Narrative. And this is a conversation that we've had for a long time at Free to Thrive about this concept of forced criminality is labor trafficking, and something that when we first started doing vacature work, we weren't sure if it would fly, if people would see what we see in our cases. And we've been very pleasantly surprised that we have been able to successfully clear records of survivors on this theory of forced criminality. And really what we wanted to do with this training is help other people see this, because sometimes it's one piece of human trafficking that's often missed is victims of human trafficking, people are exploited and seen as criminals, whereas we see them as trafficking victims and survivors. And so that's the whole goal of today's discussion, is to take a deep dive into this topic. And just like Kate said, I'm glad you said that, have some tough conversations. This is a really important topic, and it's just great that we can have these conversations candidly. So I want to first just start off of talking about whether or not labor trafficking, the title of this training gives away the answer. But does labor trafficking have to involve legal work? And when does forced criminality constitute labor trafficking? So I'm going to start with you, Jane.
It does. Labor trafficking, there's nothing saying that it needs to be legal work. I think that's what a lot of us think of, especially, folks that hear about labor trafficking the first time. They're probably thinking maybe migrant populations and agricultural work, and that could be labor trafficking. And often, we see that labor trafficking, but what we don't see being identified as labor trafficking is the forced labor services that are through sometimes illicit industries. So illicit agricultural grows, we see that in Northern California. We see, I think a lot of us are really able to see the forced prostitution, which in most states is illegal. And we say, okay, that's forced illegal activity, but we haven't gotten to the point yet where we're broadening that yet. So we see it in drug deals. And if you talk to sex trafficking survivors, you'll actually hear from them about the different types of forced criminality they endured as part of the sex trafficking scheme as well. So kind of just broadening how we're viewing this.
Thanks, Jane. Pallavi, I'm going to turn to you and ask you, when does forced criminality constitute labor trafficking?
That's a really good question. And, some of the definitions that we get kind of tangled up in are different depending on whether you're looking at the federal definition of human trafficking versus a state statute of human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, right? Like every states have like slight nuances. But at the end of the day, does it really matter like how a criminal law definition defines it when we're talking about human beings who don't have control and any like regularity in being able to have a say in what they're doing with their bodies every single day, right? Like each of us as I think a human being who's here in some professional capacity can identify the deep desire to be able to be free to do what we want to do and have control over our actions. And so anybody who is being forced to do anything, whether it's through physical force or psychological coercion or fraud, who does not have the control over their own day-to-day labor, the fruits of their physical activity, and is not getting any financial benefit from their own hard work, is labor trafficking.
Thanks, Pallavi. And Kate, I want to ask you, what are some of the common cases or fact patterns that you've seen? Like, how does this come up in real life? What are we talking about here?
Well, so first of all, not all crimes committed are forced criminality and labor trafficking, right? Like, I'm just going to start with the disclaimer there. And I think as silly as it sounds, it is kind of an important place to start, right? Because then you want to think about, so what could cause an individual to believe that they have to engage in a particular activity, right? And if they don't engage in a particular activity, they're going to be in a situation that would incur some type of, serious harm, right? Statutorily defined, that doesn't have to be physical, right? And so when you're thinking about that, you're looking at folks who have a background that are already at high risk for not just experiencing exploitation, but believing they have to endure it because they believe that A, they'll be blamed and shamed, which they will, and B, that nobody would believe them, and they don't even know what it is, right? Like in their minds, they're committing crimes, right? Like this is not something that folks come up to us and say, I'm a labor trafficking victim. I used to be an active member of a gang, and I was regularly forced to rob people. Right? Like nobody's coming to us and saying that, but these are the types of things, right, that we're talking about when we're thinking about what elements would cause an individual to believe they're stuck. And so we see folks at the margins of our societies because our system is oppressive in nature and marginalizes some and centers others with power, right? And we see folks who need to meet those basic needs of either Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? At the very bottom, the physiological, or the love and belonging, or the safety, right? And we find that these folks, whether it's their own families, whether it's gangs, however they are involved in the situation with these folks, they're providing those things, right? At a cost, at an expectation. And that expectation is also a deep loyalty, the same that we see in our sex trafficking cases.
Thank you, Kate. Pallavi, let's go back just one step and define what we're talking about when we're talking about forced criminality.
I was actually going to have Jane do that. Jane, do you want to define it, and then we can start talking about some examples?
Well, I mean, we talk about forced criminality as the separate and apart sort of typology of trafficking, but I think Pallavi hit it on the head. Overreaching, we're really talking about the exploitation of vulnerable individuals for the benefit of somebody else. And so when we think about forced criminality, it's not separate and apart from that. It's still offenders identifying and exploiting the most vulnerable people in our communities. And so we're going to maybe see the demographics a little bit different. And I think that's one of the reasons it's harder to identify, because, we were talking before the call about when we all got involved with trafficking. And I always like to date myself by saying the first time I heard of it, it was Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore talking about it. So that'll date me a little bit. And, and the first conversations were really about youth that were being forced to engage in prostitution. And that was a great way to get people interested because it was so easy to see the harm. And it was pretty easy to see how this worked. And as the field has become more sophisticated, we've seen now, recognition that, magically consent doesn't happen when we turn 18 and adults can be sex trafficked. And now we're going into labor trafficking. And that's kind of a challenge. And this is, I think, just one more step of us really recognizing that this exploitation can occur in different ways. And so one of the reasons it's harder to identify is we may have, through forced criminality, more likely to have male victims than in sex trafficking, although that also, clearly exists as well. But we may have people that look like, part of my expression, but like little gangbangers that are coming into our system, and they don't look like who we should be thinking, that a lot of people are thinking of, this is some vulnerable child that really needs our love and understanding. It's more like, this is a bad person and we need to hold them accountable for what they do. So there's some challenges there. But forced criminality is just us sort of trying to put different words on a new way to look at what has always been the exploitation of vulnerable people.
Thank you, Jane. That's so, so powerful and so true. Pallavi, I'm going to turn back to you. One of our colleagues doing this work in Florida, Brent Woody. Hey, Brent. He mentions in the chat that virtually every one of their sex trafficking clients are also labor trafficking victims due to forced criminality. And yet law enforcement and courts often don't get that. Can you share a little bit with our audience about how this comes up in sex trafficking cases?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Brent, for raising that excellent point. It's absolutely true. When we look at the most common forms of sex trafficking cases that we do see in our courts, right? Like where we do meet clients who we've kind of as a society gotten better at identifying and helping identify as victims and survivors of human trafficking. Most often we're talking about people who have endured being forced to prostitute as part of their human trafficking experience. And like Jane said, prostitution is a crime. And so when we add labor trafficking components to it, you have a quota. You have to earn $2,000 per night. You have to spend this many hours working. You have to be on this track, like working this specific street, right? That's labor lingo, right? Like that's where you're showing up for work. How many hours do you have to work? How much money do you have to make on your work shift, right? That is labor, that we are using this person's physical body to make money, and then it's going to somebody else, right? So prostitution is, in a human trafficking context, forced criminality in and of itself. But in addition to that, we also see that sex trafficking victims in that type of a trafficking scheme are forced to commit other crimes. And the biggest one that I think we really fail to identify victims as law enforcement and prosecutors and judges and even defense attorneys at is actually human trafficking itself, right? Like how many times do we have clients who were groomed and then forced to prostitute, become victims themselves, right? Are victimized, and then are told, okay, now you can either make the $2,000 tonight by sleeping with the X number of people, or why don't you go back to that foster home? Or why don't you go back to that shelter? Why don't you go back to that account on the gram and recruit more people for me? And then we see our victims who end up recruiting and teaching other people, victimizing the pimp, or the trafficker is victimizing them, but who's the one whose law enforcement is going to find the evidence against? Because when they talk to that next 15-year-old, who's the one who recruited her? Who's the one who trained her? Who's the one who helped put her ads out? Who's the one who was helping enforce the traffickers' rules and regulations? That 17-year-old, right? So now we are creating these layers and layers of victims, compounding victimization of other people, and the abuser and trafficker is never the one who's going to jail because the evidence isn't against them. I can give you like 8 different charges. If you're going to sell your body, why don't you also carry some dime bags? Now when she gets picked up, she's also going to have drug charges. You're going to make $2,000 tonight, but I also beat you up, and now you got to go get some makeup so you look presentable on the track and you can attract some customers. You're going to go by that Rite Aid or that CVS and swap that, concealer, or that, like, or you haven't had food all day because he won't feed you, and now you got to go work all night. You're going to go steal some food real quick, right? So there's like so many different examples that we can sit here and talk about just in that one human trafficking scheme, right? Like we're not even scratching the surface of the iceberg here.
Thanks, Paulvi. Jane, one of the other things that come up, and I think this has been mentioned a little bit, but not directly, is trick rolls. Can you tell us what trick rolls are and how they fit into this discussion?
Sure. We'll just take what Pallavi said and go a little bit further. We saw that a lot in Miami Beach. I also work with task forces around the country, and it tends to be something that happens in entertainment districts where folks like to come and show off their wealth by getting into VIP clubs or having expensive watches and jewelry on. And women, overwhelmingly, that had perhaps engaged in commercial sex and were, had these quotas, or, the goal was to make money. To be honest, traffickers really don't care how you make the money. They just want the money. So I think some folks realized, well, you know what? I could just bring home the same amount of money or more money by just stealing. And we actually, in Miami, originally thought that it was that there was still commercial sex going on, and then there was just this additional element of theft. But we, we saw it for what we thought was prospective trafficking, and we interviewed and debriefed some of the women that were coming in with these charges. And, we provided immunity and we debriefed to sort of really wanting intel and to better figure out what to do with these cases, because they are difficult to sort of sort through what might be an appropriate disposition. And they were saying to us, oh, we don't even have to engage in sex anymore. Like, this is so much easier, and the pimp is so much happier. And this is just the way that we now satisfy this requirement of bringing back this money. So you'll see when there's trick rolls, there's going to often be also like either complicit pawn shops or jewelers that are going to take the jewelry almost immediately from the women and then resell it in a market. So in Miami, it was often happening in Miami Beach. And then the watches and jewelry were being sold that same night to jewelry brokers in downtown Miami, and then being sold the next day at like a flea market. And so it was happening so quickly, and they were making so much money that's, the women just explained to us, this is the way that I am able to satisfy the trafficker.
Thanks, Jane. Kate, there's some differences and some similarities in terms of how this manifests in other parts of the country. Can you talk about, what forced criminality looks like in Indiana? And, when I've heard you talk about this before, you talked specifically about intersections between drug crimes and theft crimes and robberies. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. First, I want to start by saying, when I think of the definition of forced criminality, I think of somebody who is under the duress of force, fraud, or coercion to commit a crime, right? And then what we're saying is that, what if we didn't call it a crime? What if we called it labor or services? And then we already have the element of force, fraud, or coercion. So then isn't that person a labor trafficking victim, right? So all of that to say, when you're thinking about what these fact patterns look like, then you're thinking about, you have to kind of peel back your assumptions that you may have, or biases you may have around crime or why people commit crimes, and think about it more as an economic endeavor, an alternative economic endeavor, right? And in order to keep those economics in place, you have to also have hierarchies, right? And so what happens in this context of this new economy, right, and these new hierarchies, is that there are folks at the top exploiting, and it's a pyramid scheme, right? But you need folks to do all different types of things, right? Because there's all different types of opportunities out there when you're no longer kind of playing by the rules of this particular market, right? When it's whatever you can get, however you can get it, right? Then you need enforcers of your rules. You need protectors of your things. You need the people to actually do the robbing, or we have boosting cars. We have boosters. Like, do y'all know, like, that's a thing, like people who are literally referred to as boosters, and they professionally steal. So they'll like let you know, like, hey, I'm going to the store today. Let me know what sizes you're looking for. And you can literally post on, their ads or whatever, hey, I need size 2Ts or whatever. And they will literally just go steal all day, boosting, right? So that's not forced criminality. But if I had a bunch of folks that I made boost for me, and I held over their heads that, by the way, you're on probation right now. So if I call your probation officer when you're at this store, you're going to violate, you're going to go back, you're going to lose your kids, right? Now we're looking at forced criminality. So in kind of all of these instances, we see the exact same crimes that have always been committed. And like I said, you're looking at it from this different lens. And so what are the compelling factors of why this person is doing what they're doing? And so we do see a lot of drugs, sales and use. We do see anything that comes around commercial sex, right? So that could be party scene things, things like that. And cars, stealing cars, either to do illegal things in the cars, or to then, sell the cars for parts or resell the cars. So it's quite an enterprise.
Thanks, Kate. Jane, back to you. Equitas wrote this really incredible and kind of eye-opening brief about the Victor Rax case, and I'm going to put it in the chat. I also put the ASU trick roll study in the chat. We're going to email resources out to everybody afterwards, but I just want you to have them. If you haven't seen that trick roll study, definitely check it out. But I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about this Victor Rax case, and what are some of the tactics that you see traffickers use in this situation?
Thanks for bringing up that that article. I was privileged to co-author it with a former Deputy Attorney General at the Utah Attorney General's office. We interviewed a lot of folks that were involved in the case, including the special agent, who really did an outstanding job identifying and treating it for what it was. Victor Rax was a gang member and drug dealer in Salt Lake City, predominantly Hispanic community with a lot of immigrants. And he was sort of thought of as a father figure in that community. He had a lot of charisma, he had power and wealth, and he used it to groom young boys by giving them money, buying them shoes, giving them little odd jobs. Their families were grateful for Victor Rax coming into their lives and helping them. And so through this case, you see, I'm sure you guys are already seeing these parallels to what we see in child abuse and those sort of grooming abilities and practices. Well, Victor Rax eventually would sexually assault these young boys. That was really the point of the work that he was doing, was to gain access to the young boys. And then once he sort of groomed them, kept pushing that boundaries with them and sexually assaulting them, then he forced them to be part of his drug dealing operation and gang activity. He used really tactics that we're used to seeing, such as sexual abuse, but he used other things that were really interesting as well. So because of the community in which they lived, he used a lot of immigration related threats. So even if the boys themselves, a lot of them were citizens, their families were not. And so that was a big threat. He also had this, omnipotence about him. So when the boys were arrested and brought to juvenile court, he would come to court and act as and put himself out there as their father. And he was believed by the court. He also used cultural fear tactics and had these sort of shrines to Santa Muerta. And he had taken the boys' urine, hair, semen, and done curses, these curses in front of the boys who felt that they were being, that they were under this threat of a curse and their families were under this threat of course. It was a very powerful tactic. And then because of some of the cultural aspects of this community, which was very, masculine, the threat of being outed as having had sex with a man was also a real threat to many of the boys and young men who, never told anyone. This case was discovered after somebody that worked for Rax. He had been working with Rax for a long time. He was an adult. He saw Rax starting to groom his own son, and he came forward with the case. And unfortunately, when he came forward, the folks that heard this listened, and they were willing to look at it from that perspective, which I think is just incredibly wonderful, thinking about how long ago this was, what the neighborhood, the boys, like this whole piece of it, for these agents to really look at it through that lens almost immediately, if not immediately. They actually found one previous case where a boy had walked into the police station, reported that this had happened to Victor Rax, and begged to be deported. He just wanted to get away from Victor Rax. That case never went anywhere because the boy was in fact deported. But that was the second sign for them to say, okay, there's really something here. And so they did an investigation because of, through this trauma-informed way, they actually built it as a drug case against Rax. So they were able to arrest Rax on these drug charges. They held him. They fought to have him not deported because some of the victims had said, Rax has been deported 3 or 4 times and he always comes back. So there was this fear that we're not going to tell you anything. He's in custody now. You're going to deport him. He'll be back. So they actually fought to have him not deported. And once the victims saw that, and so they felt much more comfortable coming forward. I think eventually they identified somewhere around 40 charged victims and probably near 100 historical victims. And families, you know, they really looked at it as this victimization happened to families and not just individuals. So they amended their indictment and they charged him with labor trafficking under the theory of forced criminality of the forced drug sales. And then they also charged him with sexual abuse. It wasn't sex trafficking. There was no commercial element to the sexual abuse that he committed upon them. And then once that indictment was filed, Rax ended up dying by suicide in the county jail. And so the case was never fully prosecuted. But they really continued to do a great job. Instead of dropping the case against him, they actually asked for a hearing on the defendant's motion to dismiss. And the judge allowed for the victims to come to court and provide impact statements as part of this hearing. And the impact statements are incredibly powerful. And you could just see there was almost this, you know, the more people spoke, other people came forward and had this closure eventually. So that case study is really the heart of the article that we ended up writing about forced criminality. And I think it just has so many aspects to it, which can really teach us about identifying it and then how to deal with it. So of course, the victims in the case, many of them received T visas and other sort of immigration related relief for them and their families. They were treated as victims across the board. Many of them received, if not all of them, received criminal record relief for the crimes that they were arrested for and actually took dispositions for as part of the trafficking. So really great example of how we can do better.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us, Jane. I just got chills as you were talking about that hearing and, you know, what that must have been like for those victims to be able to have the opportunity to speak about what happened to them. Glad that people are really seeing this in the way that we all see it as labor trafficking and really understanding that. And the fact that there was 40 identified victims who had criminal records is 40 too many. And really that's why we're here today, is to help, you know, identify these cases for what they are when they come up. One of the other intersections that we see, and you know, we've already seen so many intersections with this issue of forced criminality, with so many of the vulnerabilities that we see in our community. Another one that we see regularly at Free to Thrive is the intersection with domestic violence and victims of domestic violence also being forced to engage in criminal activity. So Pallavi, I'm hoping you can share a little bit about how that comes up and what that intersection looks like. You know, we have folks on here who may be serving DV victims or prosecutors or law enforcement who may identify a victim of domestic violence and identify a DV case. How might they see this come up in those cases?
That's a great question, Jamie. The psychological manipulation, right? Like the power and control dynamic, the coercion that we're talking about in human trafficking cases is really not that different from domestic violence cases, right? At the end of the day, both of these are types of abuse over another person's ability to control their own actions. Right? Domestic violence abusers use the same type of power and control, abusive tactics to control what their victim is able to do. They do the same isolation tactics of isolating victims from their support network, of making sure that they feel like the only person that they can, you know, rely on or count on is their abuser. They use the same tactics for even things like making the person feel like you're in the wrong. If you call for help, no one's going to believe you, or no one is going to help you. You're the one who's going to get arrested. So a lot of the same tactics of maintaining power and control that Jane mentioned are similar in domestic violence situations. So oftentimes, like, I think at Free to Thrive, our statistics are actually quite shocking, right? Like in our client population alone, we have an over 88% correlation between human trafficking and domestic violence. In fact, like sometimes, you can think of like sexual exploitation in domestic violence situation, which is where the human trafficking component would come in as like DV plus, or like domestic violence on the next level of abuse and control. We also see, I think, a lot of times drug crimes, like a spouse or a significant other or an intimate partner in a domestic situation being forced to serve drugs, sell drugs, and other crimes that kind of steps into the forced criminality part of what Jane was talking about. And I know Jane, like, and her co-author managed to write this excellent piece in 4 pages, but just from like what she said, I think each of those pieces can be like a study of its own, right? So there's just so many layers here that I think if we can better understand, then law enforcement can begin asking better questions in investigative techniques, because the reality is that every single cop and prosecutor who worked on those 40 charges or those 40 victims with the charges knows that at the end of the day, they didn't really protect anyone, right? Because the abuser was still out there grooming more victims, creating more victims, and traumatizing more people in the community on either spectrum. So as a community, as a society, we know that we need to understand who the actual abusers, traffickers are, and get them in our investigations and not the victims, because it doesn't protect and serve anybody.
Thank you, Paulvi. And I just want to share, in case you missed it, and for those who may be listening and not able to see the chat, Ashley Pelto just added a toolkit into the chat that we'll include in our written materials afterwards. Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing that. That'll be really helpful. I'm looking forward to taking a look at that. Kate, back to you. As we're talking about, okay, this is something that's happening, but how do we screen for this? Like, how does somebody working in this space identify somebody who presents as somebody engaging in criminal activity who is actually a victim of forced criminality or labor trafficking? What are some of the red flags to look for? What should providers, law enforcement, prosecutors be looking for in their cases to identify this?
Well, I have a kind of a complicated answer to this, but I'm going to try to make it simple. So first of all, something I want to say is that in a lot of these cases, right now, you've got folks who have professional prosecutorial backgrounds on this panel. I'm not those folks, right? So what I know is that in a lot of these cases, even the best HT cases, 1% maybe are going to go to prosecution. 99% are going to be taken care of by community service providers, folks taking care of themselves, what have you, right? And so I want us to think for just a second, if this isn't about locking somebody up for labor trafficking, but rather understanding that the person sitting across from your desk is in fact a victim of labor trafficking, how would that change what you do with the person across the desk from you? What type of resources would you provide? What type of conversation? What type of cadence and candor? What type of, right? Think of how differently you would treat somebody who, to use Jane's term from earlier, comes in looking like, a bad kid, a gangbanger, somebody who causes problems, versus a kid who's going through a lot and doing everything that they need to do to survive, right? And how does that change immediately my framework? So when I start to think about red flags, the first thing I'm thinking about are socioeconomic factors, right? That those structural violence pieces, those marginalization factors. So those are going to be folks who come from communities that are at high risk for experiencing crime. Right. And there's a reason for that. And it's not because a bunch of criminals live there. It's because a bunch of desperate folks live there. Right. And desperate folks that have been intentionally taken from access to the resources they need to get out of the cycles that they're in, right? And whether those cycles are poverty or violence or both, right? And so when you're thinking about the types of folks that I feel like it should be like an assumption. It's like when somebody says, you know, you don't have to be undocumented to be a labor trafficking victim, but if you're undocumented, the likelihood of you experiencing labor trafficking and believing you have to endure it and you cannot report it is exponentially higher. So if I see a law enforcement investigation going into a restaurant and pulling 8 workers from the kitchen who are all undocumented, I would hope that their first thought is, I'm going to ask a couple follow-up contextual questions before I call ICE. Right. So, and maybe they're not going to call ICE, but you see what I'm saying, right? So this is the same concept, right? So you're coming from communities that believe that they can't utilize law enforcement or CPS, that don't believe that those entities will help them, will serve them, will protect them, will believe them. They believe that those entities will harm them and will criminalize them. So if you're already dealing with that community, you should already be thinking from that mindset, and then start asking some contextual questions about how they got into what they're doing. So I saw the car theft, the carjackings thing in DC. So who do you live with? How long have you been living with them? How are you related to them? Right? How do y'all pay your bills? Do you help your mom out with paying the bill? Right. So getting those same contexts that we would get from sex trafficking with kiddos, right? Those exact same risk factors that we're kind of trying to look into. And when we do that, we do more of a forensic interviewing style, right? These are open-ended questions. You're giving folks a chance to say things without using the term, I'm a trafficking victim, right? This is not new to us. Like we said at the beginning, with sex trafficking, folks aren't walking in and disclosing that they're trafficking victims, but they say things that let us know they are, right? And they say things and they're in situations that let us know that this is really high probability and we should look into this. And if we make this assumption and we connect this person with explicit resources for somebody who's at high risk for labor trafficking or experiencing labor trafficking, can somebody tell me what that's going to hurt? It's not going to hurt anything. It's going to be empowering. It's going to be connective. It's going to be meaningful, right? It's not going to be retributive. And I think that makes it restorative. So I think it's just a real opportunity to see a space and place to connect with people at whether it's that love and belonging, the safety, or the physiological needs, and making a meaningful connection that actually addresses the root and not the symptom. And I think we would see a really huge difference in our recidivism rate, especially with youth. So did that answer the screening question? I feel like a politician. I just said what I wanted to say.
I love it.
Sorry.
No, it's so important. And there's so much to unpack in what you said, Kate. There's so many pieces that we need to talk about. And I'm so glad you talked about root causes. And we'll talk a little bit more about, structural societal issues in a minute. But before we do that, I want to turn to Pallavi and ask you if you had anything to add on this kind of identification and red flags question.
Yeah, absolutely. Kate, thank you for taking us in that direction. I think that's a really, really important point for us to remember when we are talking about these issues. And to, anybody who's here today who is either interacting with these people in terms of law enforcement capacity or social work capacity or services capacity, this is a question we get quite often. It's like, when I'm talking to somebody, when I'm interviewing somebody, how do I figure this out, right? Like, if people are not self-identifying, how do we screen for these issues? And I think one of the problems we have as a community who's trying to do this work is inherently built within our current criminal legal system, right? Like, our legal system is has these very serious dichotomies because of constitutional rights around what defendants need to do, can't do, should do, right? All those constitutional rights that we have. And it creates this really linear system of investigations, right? Prosecutors cannot talk to defendants, right? Cops have to follow the chain of custody when they collect every piece of evidence. You have to follow the evidence and where the evidence goes. You have to keep things clean. You have to keep your witness testimony clean, right? There's all these rules. The burden of proof is incredibly high, right? So there's all these barriers in being able to accomplish what Kate is talking about in the context of criminal cases to be as restorative. But we know we want to be, right? Because we want to protect victims. So one of the things that I always suggest is currently we are trained to figure out, did a crime happen? Who committed that crime? That's it. Do we have the evidence to prove that a crime in fact occurred? And do we have sufficient evidence to prove who committed that crime? What we don't do is to pause and ask why. Why are we here? Why did this happen? Who is the person, right? And so when you start tracking down the why in terms of voluntariness, control over somebody's own actions, and the flow of money, when you're talking about cases that involve some kind of financial benefit, whether it's a Rolex robbery, whether it's a drug transaction, whether it's even prostitution, anything where there's some kind of financial gain to be had, try to figure out if the person in front of you even had any control over the money to begin with. If they didn't, why would they have done it, right? Do you work for free? I sure don't, right? So think about that in the terms of human context. And we also see oftentimes survivors getting manipulated through family, right? So like that comes up in family law cases all the time, like using children, using love as a currency, as a mechanism of control and power. So to Kate's point of like, who pays your bills? Where do you live? Who do you live with? Asking those questions that get you to figure out who the human being is in front of you will get you to some of these answers just instinctively.
Thank you, Pallavi. Jane, I want to turn to you and have you build a little bit upon what Pallavi was just talking about of, how do we get law enforcement there? You're a former prosecutor, you work day in and day out with law enforcement, helping train them on issues related to human trafficking. How can we reframe this thinking from the person in front of me as a criminal to the person in front of me as a victim of human trafficking?
Well, I think we build on what we've been doing because we've gotten there when it comes to prostitution for the most part. And sometimes I do think maybe I'm in my bubble because the people I talk to are like, yeah, we all get that. Maybe I'm being optimistic because we hear these horror stories where we're like, wow, I thought we were further ahead than we were. But I think storytelling is a great way to do it because really what we're trying to do is we're trying to build empathy in law enforcement. Law enforcement are not trained to use their discretion. They're not trained to be creative, flexible thinkers. That's not how law enforcement is typically trained. And the folks that a lot of them sort of self-select into this work are those law enforcement officers that see the human in front of them, right? A lot of the best officers that I worked with came from a background of domestic violence or investigating special crimes or investigating those person crimes where they have already, sometimes through training and sometimes through experience, have some of those more trauma-informed techniques. And so it's building upon that and just sort of saying, hey, let's just take this a little bit further because we're really just trying to show this exploitation that they understand at that level, just trying to show how it can manifest itself in different ways. One of the reasons that, I really love training the Victor Rax case is because it's so impactful, right? There's so many parts of that story where we all, get shivers, and I like well up when I think about that, that hearing where the victim impact statements were given, because that's the way that people learn and people understand, is hearing those stories, reading those impact statements, where these victims aren't just, thinking that this is over and that Victor Rax can't abuse them anymore or can't abuse other people, but they also thank law enforcement for seeing them through that lens. And I think that's also really impactful. And so just trying to build on what we're already doing and just take it a little bit further and tell these stories. And I'd love to see, really more survivors talking about this. I work with a survivor advisory council, 8 amazing folks that have lived experience as well as now very vast and amazing professional experience. And one of them, Beth Jacobs, did a survivor survey, National Survivor Network survey, and talked about where their intersections with law enforcement were. And if you control for prostitution and you control for drugs, we still had 85% having other criminal interactions with the criminal justice system. And that's what we try to push. And so we always talk about trying to say, okay, you understand that the prostitution is forced, you understand the drugs were forced, but what about the fact that I needed to use condoms and my trafficker wouldn't buy condoms for me and I didn't have any money and I shoplifted those condoms? Okay, that seems like we get there. That kind of is such a direct nexus. We can kind of get there, and it's just like trying to push those boundaries and say, you know, if I had to meet my quota, it didn't matter. And now, you know, so instead of having sex, I just stole the guy's wallet because that's what satisfied the trafficker. And so I didn't get beat. Okay, we get that. And we just need to keep pushing those boundaries and get folks to see that exploitation is exploitation. And if we just follow through on the good work we're doing, I think we can get there.
Thanks, Jane. Kate, I'm going to come back to you. I'd really love you to talk about a little bit more of what you're talking about before on issues of systemic discrimination and biases and how they come into play when we're talking about this, this issue.
Well, unfortunately, our criminal justice system is by definition racist and gendered and heteronormative and xenophobic and lots of other fun things, right? So when Jessica's posing the question that she posed in here and you're asking me what you're asking me, I'd like to reiterate my point is actually that I would like us to stop criminalizing people and start routing them into services. However, we know, and if you don't know, let me just name this very clearly for everybody, that Black women in particular have been taking charges for their pimps like it's nobody's business for a minute. And many of them have sex offenses and are on registries, right? Many of them have basically had their lives desecrated. And so being really intentional about how we talk about this is really important. Bringing in folks who are experts in these spaces and places, you know who those folks are? They're former pimps, they're former bottoms, they're former drug dealers. That's who we're talking about. So that's who needs to be at the table. And I think that often makes people really uncomfortable. Well, those are offenders. Guess what, y'all? I got to break something to you. You have all caused harm. You have all caused harm. So let's push that to the side for a second. And I'm saying all of this to say, I want to see us doing work that actually transforms the issues that have been plaguing this society since we started with a racist, classist, gendered society, right? And so when we keep trying to use the same systems to solve these issues, we have to use them really strategically. If we use them broadly, they will have broad consequences for folks of color, for queer folks, for folks who are undocumented, right? That we know that. So when we're looking at who's most likely to endure this crime, not experience it, endure it, stay in it, believe they have to do it. That's the definition of trafficking, right? Like that when we're talking about labor trafficking, they are going to be folks who are also most likely to be criminalized, who are most likely to be assumed in the wrong by law enforcement. Those are the easiest prey in this particular situation. But so is the narrative. We have a broader narrative in our society. And I think there's kind of two narratives that I think are really important for us to think about. And one is the bootstrap narrative, right? So if you're living in poverty, that's your fault because this is America and the American dream is true. And that is that you can lift yourself up by the bootstraps if you just do things the right way and you work really hard. Well, we know that that's actually not the case, right? There are folks that start off way further ahead in the race and folks that literally have a brick wall that they have to climb with their fingernails to get to the other side, right? And so when we're looking at that reality, we have to be thinking about, again, that's why I said this should already be your assumption. You're giving folks the benefit of the doubt. You're asking about situations and context because you're caring about a whole person, because you actually, if you really are involved with the criminal justice system, want to see increased safety right? In society. And if you're going to release these people, which is, as I assume, our plan at some point, where are they going? What are they doing? They're going to be right back in the same situation. It's the same thing as our folks who, when they get released and don't have somewhere to live, where do they go? Their domestic abuser, their pimp. This is the same conversation. I think the problem is, Jane hit it on the head. We're talking about Black and brown boys. We're talking about Black and brown boys with criminal records and felonies, and people don't want to see them as victims. It's hard for people to see that. It's hard for people to hear that. So I just said that. And I'm also telling you that if we don't have Black and brown men at the table with those experiences, we're going to do it wrong. And we're not going to have the reach that we want to have. So thank you for asking me that question. Yet again, I have no idea if I actually answered the question you gave me, but I'm getting a lot of 100s in the chat, so I feel good.
You definitely asked the question, Kate, answered the question, and yes, you're getting tons of love in the chat, and for very good reason, because this is so important to call this out. And you know, what you're saying reminds me, I had a survivor ask me once, you know, kind of what's your stance on the traffickers, and are you going to do anything to help them? And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, if you look at the little boy who becomes a trafficker and the little girl who is trafficked, they have the exact same background, the exact same vulnerabilities, the exact same trauma, the exact same things that put them on this path. One is labeled a victim and one is labeled a criminal. And that's the reality of the society that we're in. And you know, we have to recognize that there is significant harm that is caused by perpetrators of this crime, and we can't ignore that. At the same time, when we talk about root causes, we talk about who grows up and wants to become a trafficker and exploit other people. No child is like, I want to do that when I grow up. That's not where somebody is as a child. Society puts them on that path, and we have to understand those root causes in order to understand how somebody grows up to become a trafficker, how somebody grows up to become a buyer, and how somebody grows up to be exploited. And until we address those root causes, we are not going to stop human trafficking. All right, I'll get off my soapbox now and go back to our panelists. And I know Kate's got to jump off, unfortunately, to get to another meeting, but thank you, Kate, so much for being here and for speaking such powerful words. I'm just grateful to have you, and look forward to continuing this conversation with you.
Jamie, before I hop off, which I do
Yep.
have to do you mind if I read a spoken word piece and leave y'all with that?
Oh, I would absolutely love that. It would be hard for us to do anything else after that, because I know your spoken word is so powerful. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is called Dear Daddy, a poem to your pimp, and I wrote it in honor of all of the bottoms that I've served. Dear Daddy, are you just spitting game, or do you really believe what you saying, that she coulda, she shoulda just walked away? Let's spit some truth, Daddy. You always knew she'd stay. You knew she couldn't just walk away because you trained her to be loyal. So she took your cases and she did the time for your crimes. So her felonies remain on everyone's mind. So when she tries to leave, they never see her for all she could be. So you know you're her everything. And so does she. Flashes of darkness haunt her sleep, but she knows better than to wish for a safe place to weep. Hope is too dangerous, so the nightmares find her as her body grows weak. Made her repeat the mantra till she believed it, carved it in her skin so she could see it, invisible scars, visible Mars, filling her head with your dreams of big things that you'll build on the backs of girls enslaved, of boys in graves. But hey, an OG's got to do what they got to do, right, boo? I mean, hey, a pimp's got to eat too, and closed mouths don't get fed, so you let them give you head. Their daddies bred them for this, born to live, bred to die. They let daddy sing them another lullaby and numb the pain. What's that? Your mama taught you that song too? Oh, what else did she teach you, boo? She taught you every time she tried and failed, that she shoulda, but never coulda, walked away. Y'all, that little boy and that little girl both deserved us long before that ever happened. Thank you for having me. Sorry I have to leave early. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kate. So powerful. I wish that could be our last word. I'm tempted just to like stop right here because there really isn't much anybody can say after that. But just grateful to have Kate's beautiful poetry. And just, wow. We do have a few more minutes, so I will keep the questions going, but just definitely want to spend some time to sit with that when we're all through here. I want to come back to Jessica Emerson's comment, and I know Kate touched on it, but I really would love Pallavi and Jane to touch on it too, because it's such an important point. And thank you, Jessica, for being here and for raising it. She says, I just want to make sure that we're considering just how the push toward an expanded recognition of forced criminality may be misused and exploited by law enforcement and prosecutors as yet another way to criminalize Black and Brown folks who have themselves survived these same lack of options. Trafficking has in many ways become the new, quote, war on drugs. I'd hate to see this new framework have similar unintended consequences. Not disagreeing with the framework, but we don't want to make distribution related magically become labor trafficking. Thank you, Jessica. Jane and Pallavi, if one or both of you want to touch on that, I would love you to.
Yeah, I'm glad that that we're sort of pushing this conversation because we do see disparities and we do see these similar backgrounds. And I remember actually being at a sentencing where the trafficker was, convicted and we were at a sentencing, and because of the criminal history, he was looking at quite a bit of time, and there was nothing, there wasn't a lot of discretion for the judge based on the sentencing guidelines. And I remember the defense attorney making that argument about, the environment where this man had grown up and the opportunities that this man lacked. And it was powerful. And I think this was, 15 years ago, and I still think about it. And there's some research and there's an article that kind of goes through what the racial makeup of the traffickers versus the buyers. And I don't think we can ignore that fact. And I think one of the reasons similarly that forced criminality is not recognized for what it is because the victims are often male, Black, and Brown victims, as probably some offenders that we might recognize as well. I think first off, generally, this conversation, we haven't gotten to a point where offenders are really being arrested for forced criminality. What I think we really want to make sure we're doing is identifying the victims of forced criminality. So that's kind of where I think the conversation starts. But if we do a good job at that, then I think eventually we will start looking and trying to feel if we can hold these offenders accountable. And so we should be looking at anyone that comes to our criminal justice system through a trauma-informed lens. I'd love for us to be able to look at every case with the depth and empathy that Kate brings to the table. But right now we have to be thinking about, okay, how are we first off recognizing the victims of this and trying to restore the victims through things like vacatur, things like, finding alternative resolutions for cases, putting in dispositions that are also rehabilitative or restorative, depending on the cases. I mean, it's really hard. We're looking in the other question is, with forced criminality, we often have another victim out there, somebody whose watch was stolen, somebody whose car was boosted, somebody who owns a small business and they were robbed. And so we do have to look at this with lots of different hats on our head. And one of them should still be, looking at, who's going to be caught up as an offender, as somebody who is being charged with trafficking, and figure out, okay, what is that culpability level? I think it's the hardest thing that we do is assessing culpability. And Jamie and Pallavi, you've held similar conversations that are to that point, assessing culpability. How do we do that? The law likes to, be black and white, but we know that most of these cases, most of life, all of life is in those gray areas. And that's what attorneys' jobs are to do, is argue those gray areas. And so I think we need to bring in, I was really kind of disappointed when I saw who was on the call. Why aren't public defenders on this call? Why aren't defense attorneys on this call? Because they are often in the best position to be looking at these cases. The cases are going to come to them. Pallavi said, we don't get to talk to the defendants. And sometimes we do. I mentioned, providing some immunity and doing some debriefing when I had this sense of like, hey, something else is going on here. And prosecutors do have tools to use, but we're not in the best position to be figuring out what's going on. And so defense attorneys and public defenders, they need to be hearing these things as well so they can better serve their clients. And unfortunately, my job is sort of at this point going more on the, let's identify these victims, let's investigate these cases, and less on let's, defend, an offender that's charged with trafficking. But I do think that there's a lane there. And so hopefully, somebody's in that lane and making sure that Jessica her worries are also being, dealt with from that side of things.
Oh, such an important point, Jane. Thank you. I'm just debating there's so many directions I want to go. We've got more questions and I have one kind of closing question for both of you. I think I'm going to go to my closing question because I want to have enough time to really flesh it out if we want to discuss it a little bit more. But I am glad that you mentioned public defenders, Jane, and at Free to Fry, we've been doing a lot of training for defense lawyers. And I completely agree that I really see them as being so instrumental in identifying and, kind of helping the legal system see those who are being exploited as folks who are being exploited and not as criminals. So thank you for calling that out. And hopefully if you know a public defender or criminal defense lawyer, please send them this recording and ask them to watch this and have them send it around their offices, because that's how we, kind of get this message out there to folks who maybe aren't here today. So thank you. And we also are happy to repeat this training for any other audience, including public defenders. I'll put a plug in for that. So I apologize that we can't get to all the questions. You all have such great questions. And certainly this is going to be an ongoing dialogue. This is not the kind of conversation that we can finish in an hour and 15 minutes. There's just so much to unpack here. And I just am grateful for everybody for being so interactive and engaged in this conversation with us. But I want to just close with the question of, why is this important? Why are we even having this conversation? What is the point of this topic? Why should we care? Why is this important? Pallavi, you first.
It's important because victims deserve to be protected, not criminalized. Right? We have too many survivors, too many victims in family law cases, in criminal cases, in landlord-tenant cases who are not being protected. And that's not okay. As a society, that's not what we stand for. That's not what we should stand for, right? And so part of it is cultural competency and cultural understanding of all of these things, of domestic violence, of power manipulation, of psychological control. Part of it is just our laws, the way that they're built and how our systems are built and who they're intended to serve. To Kate's point, right? Our systems were built at the end of the day by white men for white men. That's the United States of America's entire legal structure. So in putting the why, putting the humanity, and putting the discrimination and the true suffering of people back into these systems to actually serve and protect. We shouldn't, I stopped calling it the criminal justice system, right? Because we have very little justice, not because we don't want to, but because our systems aren't built for it. So we need to put justice back into our systems.
Thank you, Pallavi. Jane?
Well, we're not identifying victims of exploitation when we only take a very narrow view of what trafficking might look like. So just again, that expansive look to really understand vulnerabilities. I think there's a lot of folks in this chat that are making such great points, and it's hard for us, kind of my lane is this former prosecutor now trying to maybe put some more justice in the criminal justice system and work with folks. But there needs to be a robust defense. There needs to be robust services. There needs to be robust prevention. There needs to be robust workers' rights organizations. There needs to be thinking about what are these underlying vulnerabilities. If we really want to start trafficking, stop trafficking, that's where we need to be looking, right? That's not my lane. I sometimes wish it were. But if we don't look at housing and, you know, just basic necessities, right? If we look at that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's, if people don't have those needs fulfilled, somebody is going to take advantage and exploit and find those vulnerable people and exploit them. So we just need to figure out, okay, what are we going to view this as? Are we going to just look at it as somebody that is a bad person doing bad things, or are we going to look a little bit deeper? And just by having this conversation, I can tell already people are like, hey, maybe I should be looking at these cases through that lens. And not saying every drug trafficker is a human trafficker, not saying everybody that's stealing drugs or stealing cars or shoplifting, but they could be. And we need to be looking through that lens, at least, you know, where we can, when we can, and better understand the control mechanisms, the vulnerabilities that are exploited, how they're exploited. And I think right now we're kind of looking backwards a lot, trying to figure out, okay, how to identify survivors who have been inappropriately criminalized and how to right that wrong. But at some point, we want to be looking forward as well and working more on that screening at the time of intersection, not be retroactive all the time. So hopefully we can, you know, through these conversations, we can just start thinking about, okay, well, the next time a case comes on my desk, let me at least, you know, sort of put that hat on and look at the facts through a different lens, or reach out to the public defender and say, hey, something about this case, you know, what do you know about the kid? What can you share? Or adult, you know, there's really, somebody asked about the screening for adults or children, and it's really sort of the same thing. And, you know, there's no magic bullet checklist, but having those conversations and just being able to sort of reach out and say, okay, what else is going on here? What else can we look for here? And it may not be trafficking, it may not legally be trafficking, but it may be an exploitive situation that doesn't rise to that, but then is just mitigation. And that's worth our time and effort as well.
Thank you so much, Jane. Carolina just said something I want to lift up in the chat, and I think it's a great place to end, is she says, we worry so much about getting the bad guy that we forget to see who is suffering in silence. That is so true, and it's really what we're talking about today, right? So thank you all for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for allowing us to talk about these difficult and challenging things. There's no easy answers to some of these issues that come up and how we address them. But just grateful for our entire panel here today, grateful for everybody who's doing this work, all of you out there. I know you're doing this work day in and day out. And you know, I think so many of the people here, you all know this and you live and breathe this. And it's the folks that maybe aren't in this Zoom today that need to hear this more than all of you, but still grateful to have you all here dialoguing with us and learning together. So just thank you for being here. I wish you all the best in this crazy time, in this crazy world. Hope you all take care of yourselves. And I hope we'll see you at the next training. We have a training coming up in April that's going to be specifically on triggers for those of you working directly with trauma victims, which I imagine every single one of you is. We're going to be learning from Dr. Brittany Greenbaum. If you've seen our trauma training, she's incredible. And I've learned so much about trauma from her. And you know, this is really something that we talk about briefly in trauma trainings, but we wanted to take a deep dive on triggers specifically. So I hope you'll join us for that. And then in May, we're going to come back and do a fourth part in this series on changing the narrative. So look forward to that. We'll send you out all this in email along with some of the resources we talked about today. And let's just continue the dialogue. Let's keep changing this narrative. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.